right. So this is interview number 1 in this series of interviews with Maltese living abroad. Today is the 10th of July. It's a big pleasure for me to be meeting Professor Barry York, who has done a lot of research work with the Maltese in Australia. So welcome to the interview, Professor York. My first question would be, can you tell us briefly what's your Maltese connection?
Certainly. I should point out that I'm not a professor. I've never been a professor. I suppose I'm a doctor. You know, I have a PhD. I did my doctorate on the topic of the history of Maltese immigration into Australia from the 1880s to 1949. I completed that in 1988. And that was how I became involved in oral history interviewing, though of course my PhD thesis was overwhelmingly based on primary source material, print-based materials and sources in archives and libraries around Australia, also in the Public Record Office in Kew in London, and in Malta at the Palace Archives. But as for my Maltese connection, the first thing that people notice is, how can I have a Maltese connection when I'm not named after a saint? I don't think there's a Saint Barry, unless somebody wants to make one named after me, which is very unlikely. And my surname is York, not a Maltese surname. My father, Loretto, was Maltese, born in Sliema in 1918. He died in Australia in 2009, aged 90. He, as the name Loretto will indicate to you, all his brothers and sisters and his parents, my grandparents, and their parents, etc., they were all from Einseelen, Gozo, you know, Madonna tal Loretto.
Yeah.
So the mother, his mother wanted to make sure he remembered his origins from Gozo, because he happened to be number 11 in the family. And by that time, they had moved to Sliema in Malta itself. So he was the only one born actually in Malta and not Goziton. And you can imagine how he used to have fun with his brothers, teasing them that he was superior because he was from Sliema and they were Goziton, you know, all in good fun, of course. Actually. But my father volunteered for the military in Malta when the Italian fascists started bombing the island in June 1940. And he ended up in the Royal Air Force, not as a pilot, but on the ground, you know, as a mechanic's assistant. They sent him to the Middle East, and then North Africa, Sudan, Palestine, and he ended up after the war in London. And in London, he met my mother, who was a Cockney Londoner, English woman. And my dad decided in 1947 to change his name from Malak, Milak, they say in Australia, Malak, change it to York. There were many reasons behind that, but I think essentially he loved London. He loved the cosmopolitan life of the big city. He had nothing to go back to in Malta. You know, his parents were dead now. His brothers and sisters were all over the place or married in Malta and couldn't really look after him. He was the youngest, don't forget. And I think he saw his future outside of Malta. And he did find back then there was a bit of discrimination You know, it didn't matter if you wore the uniform of the Royal Air Force or not. If you were a foreigner in London, it was a disadvantage, especially if you had a foreign surname that was difficult to spell. So he made the decision to change his surname by deed poll in 1947, and he wanted an easily spelt English kind of name. He said he never regretted that, but he always insisted that he would never, ever have changed his first name, Loretto, because his mother had given him that name. But he said, the surname, you're born into it. It's like a fluke in a way, isn't it? You know, he was always very Maltese. Heaven help anybody who said anything against Malta. And I was in situations as a kid that were embarrassing to me because somebody once said, oh, Malta, that's a rock in the Mediterranean. And I remember my dad losing his temper. That's the Gosseton blood, I guess, from his ancestors. And he told this Australian man, he said, look, we might be small, but we're very rich in culture and history and courage. And my dad actually said, and we didn't need a handful of convicts to steal our country from the Aborigines. I thought, oh, gee, there's going to be a fight, you know, but that's how my dad was about Malta. Very defensive and very proud, even though he had changed his surname. And people often say, oh, he shouldn't have changed it. But he used to say to them, well, it was my choice and I did put my life on the line fighting fascism. And I feel that I have that freedom to change my surname if I want to. He always spoke fluent Maltese. He loved meeting other Maltese and speaking with them in the language. But later in life, I noticed that some of the younger Maltese that he'd meet in Australia, they would say, oh, gee, you speak the old Maltese, because he learnt it from his parents who were born in the late 19th century. That was the Maltese my dad spoke. And that was all he knew up till 1940 when he joined up and then never went back to Malta. So anthropologists, I think, would have, or linguists would have found my dad interesting from that point of view. But yeah, he was, I did an oral history interview with him, a very lengthy one that we did over many sessions. And I asked him at the end, so Dad, how do you see yourself today? Are you Maltese or Australian or what? And without hesitation, he said, of course, I'm Maltese. He also had the Maltese accent. He tried hard to speak proper English because he saw it as, again, advancement, you know. But he, like Thursday was always Thursday and other indicators of the Maltese sort of accent when English is being spoken. Okay. So that was my, that's my connection through my dad, through my Uncle Joe and Uncle Mike and Auntie Mary and Auntie Nina, all of whom migrated eventually to Australia. And my dad, by the way, ended up as a factory worker, like most or many Maltese migrants. He became active in the trade union, in the factory where he worked, and he was very respected and became the shop steward representing the workers. And one of the achievements that I'm quite proud of was that when the unions were fighting for equal pay for women in Australia, because the factory where my dad worked was mainly women, it was a cosmetics factory, a couple of hundred women who were packers, and a handful of men like my dad who were manufacturers, mixing the creams and cosmetics and that. The union decided to use that factory as a test case for equal pay. And my dad, believe me, Manuel, he was a very charming, handsome Maltese bloke, and he won over all the women to the idea that they should have equal pay. And in the Storeman and Packers award, that factory was a test case for equal pay, and they won. And I think this is pretty typical of Maltese migrants. You know, they're quiet achievers, but the more I've looked into it, I'm amazed at how many Maltese just quietly have made real contributions that have improved Australian society.
Billy, you wrote a number of books about the Maltese in Australia. But you also you also contributed to the history of Polish immigrants in Australia. First question about this: what led you into taking this Maltese immigration so seriously that you made it your basically your academic focus?
Well, I mainly was working on researching the Maltese in Australia. I did that from 1984 really for the rest of the 1980s, archival research and oral history interviewing, because in the 1980s, especially the mid-1980s, I was able to interview people who'd come out from Malta to Australia in the 1910s, prior to World War I. And I'm pleased to say that those few recordings with that vintage, there's a few only, but they are now preserved for posterity. And it kind of frightens me when I listen to them and I think, good heavens, they are voices of a migrant experience of more than 100 years ago. And we're hearing the actual voices. It's the power of oral history as a way of experiencing and learning about history. But I became very committed to the topic. I think I'm the sort of person who, if I commit to something, I give it my best. You know, I try to go the second mile. And I was aware that there was a gap in Australian history. There were many stories not being told back then, and the migrant experience was a big gap in the story, especially the absence of stories or histories of particular migrant communities and ethnic groups. And because of my Maltese background, I thought this was an area where I could make a unique contribution. As you know, all us historians, we like to make a contribution that's new, that's adding something and opening new ground. And I think I was fairly successful in doing that with my doctorate and the book that was published from it and other writings. It certainly made people aware that this Maltese community, though not one of the biggest in Australia, it had made a disproportionate contribution, be it at Mackay in Queensland, in the sugar fields, or on the waterfront in Melbourne, where at one point a third of the workers were Maltese, you know, because they'd worked in the dockyards in Malta. Or even increasingly in academia or public service or the sporting field. You know, it ended up across the board. There's hardly an element of Australian life where you don't have Maltese contributing. And you watch TV programs, and sure enough, when the credits roll, there will always be the Maltese surname, you know, which is probably a third generation now or second generation. But the main Maltese migration, as you know, it occurred in the post-war period, 1950s and 1960s. Then it declined in the 70s. And today, my dad would be very pleased to, I think, to see Malta as a place that receives immigrants and where the young people have Europe as their, any part of the EU they can go to and study or just have holidays. And, you know, I often reflect on that, Emmanuel, how my father would see things and how the Malta of today compares to his Malta, where he would talk about the poverty that his family experienced. You know, the mother looking after 7 children while the father was away with the merchant navy, because that's what his father ended up doing. His dad was Salvatore Salvu and his mum was Loretta. Now they had 11 children, but as was common back then, 4 died as babies. And that was just normal back then. My dad remembered beggars in the streets. He remembered his father getting discarded tins that had been thrown out and fixing them to make drinking utensils from them, like cups or mugs, you know. So yeah, my dad would find, especially Slima today, he would be astonished, I think, but he'd be happy that people seem to be doing okay now and don't have to emigrate like they once did. Yeah. Well, not to the end of the earth, as my, he told me that his mother used to say, oh, Australia, that's the end of the earth, the end of the world, because one of her sons, my dad's brother, Joe Malak, he went to Melbourne in 1924, he migrated, and it was through him after the war that the others were able to be sponsored and nominated. And Joe worked on the waterfront for 44 years. And I loved him so much that I named my son Joseph after him. He was a great man and a real Gosseton.
Okay. Barry, when you compare the Maltese community to other ethnic groups, what differences and similarities maybe do you see?
Well, you mentioned the Polish project. I've been involved in projects to do with the Polish people and also Italians in Australia. And that was mainly oral history work, interviewing the early arrivals. And look, all of them, you can say, had strong arms and brave hearts. That's how I like to sum it up for that generation of migrant, because they were traveling so many thousands of kilometers into the unknown. I believe they all wanted to get away from Europe, the memories of war, the losses that they'd suffered. So the distance involved in Australia had a positive aspect to it as well. But gee, you know, you compare parts of Australia to Poland or Italy or Malta, and you can appreciate what an adjustment there was. They all came here wanting a better future, not just for themselves, but for their children. And when I've interviewed people, this is a recurring theme, that it wasn't just about them. People don't realise that a lot of the Maltese who emigrated after the war, they did have jobs in Malta. You know, there was the reconstruction program. They knew the future wasn't very secure because the British were gradually downwinding their presence, and so much of the economy depended on the dockyards. But they were thinking really of the future for their children. That's the recurring theme, be they Polish, Maltese or Italian, or the English as well. They were the biggest migrant group to Australia, and they also weren't entirely welcome. You know, people forget that the term bloody Poms was often used. There was, my dad used to say that he was shocked at how insular Australians were in the 1950s and 60s, that he'd been in London and he thought Melbourne would be like a mini version of London, but he found them very narrow-minded and old-fashioned, and they hadn't really travelled much. They only knew Australia, and they weren't all very friendly to the new arrivals who were culturally different in many ways, you know. So it was hard to adapt and adjust. But these people, the migrants, they take the risk and make that incredible journey for something better than what they left behind. And this is why I'm all in favour of mass immigration in Australia, that people come here to improve their own lives, and in doing so, they've helped improve the Australian society in general. So they're the qualities that I find in common across the ethnic groups, you know, this determination to improve their lives for themselves and their children, and a desire for a new start. But also there's the desire to retain aspects of their cultural heritage that have meaning to them. With the Maltese, we know that's the language and to a large extent the religion and the community sense. So in areas like the western suburbs of Melbourne, the western suburbs of Sydney, where most settled after the war, you had significant Maltese meeting places and clubs and cultural centres, which again, it was good for them as Maltese, but I think it was also good for the Australian society to have access to all this new cultural input. And of course, everyone talks about the cuisine, you know, how it contributed to diverse tastes and enjoyment for the old Australians, who gradually changed and gradually became more open-minded, I think. We settled in Brunswick in Melbourne, which was a low income, it wasn't a sought after place. It had factories in our street and lots of migrants. And initially there was some resistance to the new arrivals, but eventually, I mean, we were all low income people who had bills to pay. They had children to get educated, you know, had to pay uni fees and that kind of thing. And that was more important than turning on each other and being spiteful or nasty. So when I look back on my 30 years growing up in this semi-industrial working class suburb, I think, gee, I was privileged to have such a wonderful education from the dozen different ethnicities that I grew up with. It was literally a dozen different ethnic backgrounds in our one street, Shamrock Street in West Brunswick.
So you pointed out at the similarities in the migrant experiences of different ethnic groups. What about the differences? Are there any particularities, except for that the Maltese immigrants had their own language and their religious customs, but are there any other qualities which distinguish them from other ethnic groups, maybe?
I know that people who aren't Maltese, but who know Maltese, and I'm always astonished by how many, you know, you mention, I tell people I'm of Maltese background, oh, I worked with a Maltese, or our neighbour was Maltese. The qualities that are always mentioned are that they are hard-working people and hospitable and friendly. I can't say whether Poles or Italians or Greeks also are like that. You know, I haven't looked into it with them, not in any detail. But with the Maltese, that's certainly the reputation, friendly and hardworking.
The fact that Maltese came from a tiny place compared to Britain or Italy or Greece, and the fact that the Maltese left the island, which was a colony, a British colony, whereas Italy had a totally different history, and Britain had a different history, and Greece and so on. Did that make any difference, maybe in the forma mentis of the Maltese in Australia? I mean, we came from such a tiny place into this vast land of Australia. Did that make them, I don't know, look at things differently, maybe? At life in general, I mean.
I think this is where the settlement patterns are important, and the experience or the process of chain migration. My understanding is that before the war, and including after the war, you would have a village or town-based chain migration that, like my Uncle Joe from Einseelam, Gozo, migrated in 1924, had very hard time during the Depression, but then things settled and things were going well. And he assisted other people from Einseelam in Gozo, cousins and, you know, people he knew. Some of them worked on the waterfront with him. He got them jobs on the wharf. And that happened in many of the villages and the towns around the dockyard area after the war, where you would have somebody from Bormla, let's say, had migrated. Often it was the man of the house on his own. He works, he finds accommodation, then he sends for the wife and children, and they come and join him. And gradually they build or buy their own home. But the thing was that they could also, in the western suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney, they could buy land fairly cheaply, and they were allowed to build a shack, basically, on that land, one room. And then as they earned money and became more secure, they would add a room at a time. I lived in St Albans, one of the western suburbs of Melbourne, for a couple of years, and I used to see the remaining examples of that. There would still occasionally be the one room on a quarter-acre block of land, you know, that I guess they had never got round to adding the rooms or whatever. But I may have wandered off your point. What was the...
No, my question was the fact that the Maltese went to Australia and they left a tiny island compared to the Brits, compared to the Italians, and not only a tiny island, but colony, you know, whereas this was not the story of the other countries, the European immigrants going to. If that made any difference in the way the Maltese thought about life in general, you know, leaving a tiny island and a tiny colony and then going to this vastness of Australia, you know, even when it comes to the physical aspect of it, you know, the sheer size, the distance, and what have you.
Yes, the reason I was talking about chain migration from particular villages was that even though it was a vast new land that they were coming to, there is a pattern of chain migration in particular areas, like Mackay in Queensland. They tended to come from Mosta and Maliha,
Okay.
In off the top of my head, I can't remember the other patterns, but it was not, well, West Melbourne, in the Melbourne area, which was near the waterfront and near the a lot of factories. A lot were from Gozo. A lot of Gozatans went there immediately after the war. But that was kind of the pattern. So I think that meant that the vastness geographically didn't impact them, or it was compensated for by this sense of community, that they were encouraging and sponsoring and nominating people from their own village or the villages nearby, and they were coming to the same suburb or locality.
Okay.
And this is generalizing. And you see it to this day, even though the community life is declining, of course, in Australia, of the Maltese, but they have like the Nadur Association, and they have these village-based associations, and they're normally in the same suburbs where you get a concentration of people from those locations in Malta. So they had that, yes, it would have been big and vast, but it was, the community would have retained that sense of, would have compensated for the vastness and any disorientation from that. The churches played a big part too in the immediate post-war period. It was important to have Maltese priests who could hear mass and confession and all that in Maltese. And the church supplied a pretty steady supply of priests. Soccer, football was another development that gave the Maltese this sense of belonging to a locality. In the western suburbs of Melbourne was the George Cross Soccer Club, and now it's called the, well, now they have the Green Gully Soccer Club, which is more based on the location or the suburbs. And of course, in the Maltese homes, the customs were maintained of saints' days or cuisine, cooking. You know, that first wave of Maltese, all they knew was how to cook Maltese minestra or pastizzi, macaroni, you know. Even my mum, even though she was English, she naturally wanted to make my dad happy, and she would make pastizzi, a beautiful pastizzi she made, but they were more like a cross between a Cornish pasty and a pastizzi. And I often say this was an example of cultural blending.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but she made it all. She'd do the rabbit stew and macaroni baked and all that for Dad and me. I hope I've answered that.
Yeah,
question.
you did. Earlier on, you mentioned that the Maltese migrants, like other migrants coming from other countries, they were very committed to retain their cultural backgrounds. And you mentioned particularly religion and language. We know that they even celebrate in certain places. I know of Melbourne because I have family there. That they also they have their band clubs and their processions with the statues, like we do over here. But when it comes to language, how did the Maltese try to retain their linguistic background and their linguistic identity?
Well, I know that it was important, again, through interviewing or just informally talking with the first generation of Maltese migrants after the war, it was very important to them. I find that very few people say, oh, we made a big mistake migrating. But the one regret that sometimes is expressed is a disappointment that their children in Australia didn't maintain the language or the religion and customs, you know, that they retained bits of them, speak or understand a bit of Maltese, but the parents often wish that they had retained more of the Maltese culture. And what they did, the community organisations that the migrants set up, they often included language classes, and these are still occurring today, but I'm not sure how popular they are.
I was going to ask you exactly that. How popular are they? How successful has this attempt been?
If we look at census data, which asks questions about parents, birthplace, ancestry, and languages spoken at home, the Greeks come across as maintaining a high level of language retention among the second generation. The Maltese, not so much. And I think the Italians also have a high level. But with the Maltese, you mentioned being a British colony, and there was a degree of fluency in the English language, especially among the dockyard workers and the city or township dwellers who migrated. And so it was very easy to adopt the English language in those situations outside the home. Whereas for other groups like the Poles, you know, they found it a lot more difficult. I think this is speculation on my part, but I think it makes sense and is reasonable. So certainly there have been dedicated people in the Maltese community who feel very strongly that the language must be promoted and taught to. We're now into the third generation of Maltese Australians. My daughter, Hannah, she is crazy about Malta and things Maltese. She cooks Maltese dishes, and she is having Maltese language lessons in Melbourne. But I don't really know how common that is. It would be interesting to speak with the people who run the classes and to see what the numbers are. The problem is Australia is such a multicultural country, and there are some languages that have an advantage in terms of this globalized planet that Maltese doesn't have. I would have loved my daughter to speak Maltese with my dad. And I think that is a motivation, you know, to speak to the grandparents in the language. But beyond that, unless you're going to Malta and want to live there and speak the language, I think a lot of young Maltese Australians are more likely to learn Mandarin or Spanish, you know, the global languages. Again, it's speculation, but I think it's a reasonable expectation that they would want a language that opens many doors in many countries. And for better or worse, Maltese doesn't do that on that same scale.
I know you keep saying that this is speculation, but of course it is a very informed opinion you are expressing through your work and your academic commitments. So do you really think that the reason why the Maltese were not so successful, let's put it this way, in retaining the language and passing it on to to successive generations in Australia. Do you think that the reason behind this was the fact that we were practically bilingual, even back home, that is, that we were so near the English language because of the British colonization? Do you think that this is it? Or maybe there could be other reasons, I don't know, very low self-esteem perhaps, or things like that?
Well, we know for sure that Malta was unusual in that it had a very distinctive, unique language of its own, but was also pretty much bilingual, with English being the other official language now, isn't it? Maltese and English. Italians, Greeks, Polish migrants weren't in that situation at all. It's very different. So it would make it easier for the Maltese, I think, to have that temptation to speak English in a predominantly English-speaking country outside of the home. I think the second generation often could understand Maltese. I've been told that by a few people, oh, we understand, but we can't speak it.
Yeah.
Because they would listen at home and understand what was being said by the parents. The other factor is marriage outside the group, like Maltese. Off the top of my head, I haven't looked at data on that for a long time, but I think there was a higher level of marriage outside of the Maltese group than with Greeks, for example, in Australia. And culturally, I guess you can understand that, in that while Maltese had a distinctive culture, they were influenced by the British. And like my dad, like I said, he certainly was impressed with London, and he married an English woman. And that's not terribly unusual in Australia for Maltese men to have married non-Maltese women. The children then grow up not really hearing much Maltese spoken at home because, you know, if one partner can't speak the language, then it's not spoken. It's interesting to speculate about what will happen in the future on this score. Will there be some kind of a resurgence of interest in the language? I don't know, but one of the things that inspired me with my research about the history of the Maltese in Australia and their contributions and their struggles and so on was the idea that it was something I felt that young Maltese Australians should know about. And I can see that that is a kind of link to the culture in a certain way, that they are interested in the history of what their parents and grandparents and so on went through and how they contributed, where they fit in the story of Australia. I do find that a lot, actually, from second or third generation who are really keen to learn about that. And often they are the ones who encourage their parents or grandparents to do the oral history interview. You know, it's so funny that people who came here in the 1950s, you know, they worked so hard, accommodation was a big problem, and they will often say, oh, I don't have much of a story to tell, you know, whereas to me, as a historian, invariably their stories are amazing and important to a fuller understanding of our society. So I know that I can always win them over by saying, well, look, this isn't just for me and for a history book. This recording will be for your children and their children and so on. and then that usually wins them over and they agree to do an oral history interview. I've done a few hundred oral history interviews.
I was reading about this.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing I want, again, when you mentioned the Maltese migrants' commitment to retain their Malteseness, you mentioned language and religion mostly, and the cuisine, of course. Now, I was wondering if there were other cultural events being organized besides the festa and the band marches, which could also have helped to retain this, I don't know, for example, literary evenings or commemoration of Maltese personalities. Were there any such events taking place in Australia?
Yes, in 1983, there was a very big event that was held at the Sydney Opera House, organised by the Maltese Community Council of New South Wales to commemorate the centenary of the first attempt at organised Maltese migration to Australia. That first attempt occurred in 1883 when a group was sent to Queensland to work in the sugar fields. And I didn't actually go to that event, but I've read about it and been told about it, and it was very successful, very big. There's also been organisations based around the migrant boats that brought people here. My friend Mark Caruana in Sydney, who you must talk to, is
tomorrow.
Great, good. He really set me on the path of doing oral history interviews. He's a true expert in the field, and he has the benefit of speaking Maltese and being culturally Maltese. But Mark, I think, had been involved in organising some of these events at the Maritime Museum in Sydney, based on the boats, like the Strathnaver, the Asturias, and the famous one, the only migrant boat to sink on the way to Australia, which I recorded interviews with the people, some of the people on it, and Mrs. Kamantzuli, who was on that vessel when it sank. She wrote an Ana, a folk song about it, which we recorded for the Australian National Library. It's in Maltese, but we've got an English translation as well, and I've put that on YouTube as a YouTube clip. And you know, I've gone blank as to the name of that boat. 1958, the only one to sink at sea, that had the Norwegian flag. Oh, geez. Oh, what was the name of it? I'll let you know when I.
Okay, for sure. We have a very young literature when compared, of course, to other European literatures. It goes back only a bit more than 100 years, maybe a bit more. How much were the Maltese, interested in their literature when they were in Australia?
It's really hard for me to answer this because I wasn't that interested in the Maltese language literature myself, but I did have a fair bit to do with some of the Maltese literary figures.
Okay.
And I actually recorded a small project where I interviewed Maltese poets in Australia. And I had an article published based on those interviews, which, if you haven't seen it, I must send it to you. was in the National Libraries magazine. There were people like Roderick Bovington, Manuel Nicholas Borge, who was a very good friend. He went to school with my dad in Slima. He was prolific and usually wrote in the Maltese language. And there was Joseph Abella in Melbourne, who I think founded the Maltese Literature Group in Melbourne. So I've got to be careful saying somebody founded something, because others might say, no, he didn't found it, but he was very active and a leader in that area. There was Joe Saliba, another one in Melbourne, who another prolific poet. And I interviewed about half a dozen Maltese migrants who'd retained this interest in poetry in particular. And and there was a Valentine Barbara in Sydney. But I was interested in that. For one thing, like even my dad used to like writing poetry. My dad only had 4 years of education, see, in Malta. And it interested me, how come Maltese men seem to be interested in poetry? Like there seemed a disproportionate thing happening. And one of the theories was that for that generation, they would go to church at a very young age. And occasionally, like in my dad's case, they would get up and they would recite from the Bible. I'm not sure what the custom is or the ritual, but my dad told me he would have to get up and do this. And so they kind of grow up with a sense of poetry, a poetic sense from the church experience as children. But I'll send you the article that I wrote. I've scanned it, and it's all there. I adopted the whole of life approach, asking them about their upbringing in Malta, why they migrated, why Australia, and why poetry. And I recorded them reciting in Maltese their poetry. But nearly all of those are no longer with us. And I really don't know whether among the second and third generation there's the same interest. The other aspect of Maltese culture that was kept alive was the ana.
Okay, tell us about it, please.
Yeah, well, again, through the National Library of Australia, and a colleague of mine, Kevin Bradley, who is a brilliant musician. He plays guitar, he makes guitars, he's hardly ever without a guitar. He fell in love with ana when I told him about it, and he came to a club when I was living in St Albans in Melbourne, and he was fascinated by the rhythms and the tuning of the guitar, but also by the way it was expressed, you know. And so he was quite a senior person at the National Library, and we put our heads together and persuaded the National Library in Canberra to embark on a project of recording the Anea in Melbourne and in Sydney. This was in the late 1990s, so there was still the first generation who were doing it in the Maltese clubs. And there are many, many hours of those recordings that are pretty significant for Malta as well, I think.
Extremely, yeah.
And there were a few younger people, a couple of second generation young fellows who could do the tuning and the rhythms and all that, but I don't know whether it has continued, because I now live in Canberra. There's not a big community here. And I haven't been to any of the Maltese clubs in Melbourne or Sydney for a long time. But it used to be very popular in the late 1990s when I lived in St Albans, you know, at the local club. People would wait for the Arnea to come out and they'd do that dueling thing. Very clever. And even though I don't understand or speak Maltese, there'd always be somebody I'd be with who would tell me what they were saying, how they were attacking each other's village, or, you know, having a go at their physical appearance or whatever. And yeah, so we ended up recording a lot of it, and those recordings are preserved for posterity, like the oral history interviews at the National Library of Australia. And I'm sure one day somebody in Malta will see that as a gold mine of cultural heritage. Because these blokes who were singing and composing and playing, they, in the main, they wouldn't have returned to Malta other than for a holiday. So what they are performing is what they knew about Ana in the late 1940s or 1950s when they migrated. Whereas I believe that in Malta, Ana, like the language itself, has been developed or modernized or have all these new influences, which goes back to younger people telling my dad, oh, gee, you talk the old Maltese, you know?
Yeah. Barry, I have one last question, which you led me to pose to you from your last message you gave me regarding the first generation Maltese and their expression. Was it nostalgia, mainly nostalgia for the lost home that they expressed through Ana, through poetry, through whatever? Was it a nostalgic, outlook at the lost home?
I think so. I think that they certainly did not want to make a total break from home. And a lot of them, like I said, were factory workers. But while accommodation was difficult back then, employment wasn't. And my dad sometimes had two jobs, work during the day, then a job at night. That was my first job, helping him in his second job when I was just 12 or 13, you know. And so they could make money, and eventually you found Maltese going back to Malta for holidays quite regularly, every 5 years or whatever. So they could retain that connection with Malta. But when that wasn't happening, I do think that things like going to the Maltese club, having your pastizzi and baked macaroni and kinny, we had kinny here, and chisk, is it the beer? And they could do that and appreciate the Ana or the other types of like mandolin playing, and, you know, which to me always sounded a bit like a Spanish type influence, beautiful melodies. And there's no doubt that people will naturally, I think they either cut off entirely, which is a minority who can do that. But most people, we're human beings. And of course, wherever we grow up, we will have a nostalgic or a sentimental reflection on that period. Sometimes I think it can be a bit romanticized. But then on the other hand, the few hundred people that I've interviewed about their migrant experience from Malta, they're not shy about saying that things were hard. You know, it wasn't all rosy, but there are the qualities that they miss. You know, my dad would always talk about the blue Mediterranean, how blue it was. Growing up in Slima, he'd talk about walking along the coast of the Esplanade, buying a packet of peanuts, sitting on a bench in the evening, chatting up girls as they walked by. You know, he even said he'd go to they lived in Santa Rita Street in Slima, if anyone knows Santa Rita Street. He said he'd walk down to the water, and on occasions he'd see squid and he would catch them in his hand. And he would say all that with a real deep nostalgic yearning. But at the same time, he'd talk, as he does on the oral history interview, he'd talk about the poverty and the problems and how they ate lots of potatoes when the father was at sea for months, because that's what they had to eat. They didn't have much, they were poor. And so, look, it's the more I look into it, I see that there are general patterns, the push and the pull factors in the migration process. But the more you look into it, the more you put it under that magnifying glass, you see the individual stories, the individual motivations. And often people don't precisely fit the broad patterns, but they have their own complex personal reasons for, and their personal responses. But as I said earlier, I do think that the overwhelming majority of the Maltese who migrated to Australia after the war, that mass migration, very few of them would say, oh, it was a big mistake, we regret having done it. But it was manageable for them because they were usually settling in Maltese communities, St Albans, Sunshine, Western Suburbs, West Melbourne, Blacktown, Greystanes, Pendle Hill. And so they had the best of both worlds in a sense. But in saying that, I will not underplay how hard they had to work, Manuel. The factory work, they were factory fodder, we have to admit that, you know. And had it not been for the Maltese and other factory workers, Australia's post-war industrial growth would have been much slower.
Okay. Barry, I must really thank you for this wonderful interview. It's been inspiring. Also, I will be interviewing other Maltese immigrants throughout this week, basically, and I will have the pleasure to interview them. So I must thank you. I will end the recording right now. Okay.